Chapter 15. Call of the Silver Trumpet. So Lannis worked in Farmer Broadleaf's fields, and stayed as a guest at Farmer Broadleaf's house. Day after day in the hot sun he worked, and during the evenings, in the large cheerful kitchen of the farmhouse, Lannis told his friends about the king and his castle. The farmer and his wife and his 3 young sons listened earnestly and asked many questions. Lannis, on his part, was glad of the chance to talk of his king. Many times during the course of those evening talks, Lannis had an opportunity to point out how the king desired men to come to him and become his followers. He would, on these occasions, ask the farmer and his wife to visit the castle with him, and he asked his other friends. But neither Farmer Broadleaf nor his wife would give him a definite answer. They were interested, they wanted to come, Lannis was sure, but they would not promise. Best of all on these evenings, Lannis enjoyed talking to the Broadleaf children. They would gather around, asking him questions about his life at the castle, and listening open-mouthed to his answers. 2 of the 3 boys wanted to hear of nothing over and over again but battles and adventures. But Henda, a thin, quiet lad, who was the middle one of the 3 in point of age, was different. He listened eagerly to every detail that Lannis spoke about the king and his castle and the king's great book, and would sit by the hour with burning eyes fixed on Lannis's face, asking him questions and more questions. And so the weeks went by. Each day Lannis polished his weapons and longed for the time when he could return to the king's castle, but always it seemed that there was more work to be done that could not be handled by the farmer alone. Finally, it seemed that the end had been nearly reached. Most of the harvest had been gathered in, and what was left could easily be done by Farmer Broadleaf himself. Wood had been cut and stored for the winter, and enough food had been brought into the roomy basement of the farmhouse to last the family through the cold season. Lannis decided he could stay no longer, but before he could tell Farmer Broadleaf of his plans, the call came. It was nearly noon, and Lannis was working shoulder to shoulder with Farmer Broadleaf in the sun-warmed fields when suddenly, in the distance, he heard the trumpet call. He raised his head and listened. There it was again. Faint and far away, it was nevertheless unmistakably the sound of the silver trumpet. Lannis dropped his scythe. Farmer Broadleaf, the king is calling, and I must return to the castle. The farmer nodded his grizzled head. I have been fearing that you might leave us soon, he said. When must you go? Lannis lifted his eyes to the ridge of the great mountains, where the sun glistened on the distant castle turret just visible over the trees. Once again the trumpet call floated faintly down the wind. Now, he said. Farmer Broadleaf sighed. Very well, he said. I will go back with you to the house while you gather your belongings. The whole Broadleaf family was gathered in the kitchen when Lannis came down from his bedroom ready to leave. Lannis crossed the room and stood before the farmer and his wife. I wish you and your family would come to the castle too, he said. We have talked many times about it, said the farmer, looking at the floor, but we are old and brooded here. You can never be too old to come to the king, answered Lannis, and Mrs. Broadleaf's eyes suddenly filled with tears. Perhaps, husband, she said softly, if Lannis will return for us in a few weeks, we can go to the castle, at least on a visit. I want very much to go. Farmer Broadleaf hesitated a moment, then nodded his head. But then the boy Henda came from the corner of the fireplace and stood before his parents. I want to go now, he said. I want to be a soldier of the king and go with Lannis. May I? The farmer and his wife looked at each other for a long moment. Then the farmer said hesitantly, If the boy really wants to go, we must let him. We can trust Lannis to take care of him. And so it was that Lannis, a few moments later, left the farmer's house and started down the high road towards the Green Mountains. Young Henda went with him. Mr. and Mrs. Broadleaf and the other 2 children stood at the gate to see them go. Wait for me, called Henda over his shoulder to his mother and father. I will come back soon with Lannis and take you to the castle. Lannis and Henda walked rapidly down the high road, and by late afternoon reached the slopes of the great mountains. As the sun went down and twilight began, Lannis imagined that a faint, disquieting chill crept into the air. It disturbed him, and long before they reached the shadows of the woods, he had drawn his sword and slung his shield into ready position. The woods, like the field below, were peaceful, but the chill persisted. It was a vague, penetrating cold, and reminded Lannis forcibly of the atmosphere of the Valley of Despair. "Something is wrong," he muttered to himself, and redoubled his watchfulness as he pressed forward. No enemy appeared, but it was not until the last turn was rounded and the castle gates came into view that Lannis relaxed his vigilance. The gate was opened by one of the youngest of the king's soldiers. When they were safely inside, Lannis turned to him. "Can you tell me where to find Jamin? I would like to report to him at once." "He is in the field with the rest. There are only a few of us here guarding the castle." "Is the trouble that serious?" asked Lannis anxiously. "It is very serious. The enemy has gotten between us and the valley. I don't know how you managed to get up the path. The evil ones have been massing their forces to attack us for some time. We knew that, but we didn't know where the blow would come. Today they attacked us from the valley, overran the ridge, and captured the tower above the path. This evening they began pushing towards the castle. Jamin is leading our forces." "Jamin? Where's Lada? And Gain?" "Lada has been very ill for several weeks and cannot leave his bed. Gain was badly wounded in the enemy's first attack and lies in the castle." Lannis stood staring at the other lad for a moment, while the full meaning of what was said dawned on him. Then he wheeled towards the gate. "Let me out," he said crisply, "and look after Henda here until I return. Make him comfortable and welcome. I must go to Jamin." Once again the gate swung open, and Lannis, sword in hand, darted out into the night.